Not only can the government not interfere with your speech, the government is very limited in its powers in what it can make you do to access speech. And of course, if you are looking at adult content, which is protected speech for adults, and you're forced to do something that is technically, at least until very recently, unconstitutional because you should not have to act in a certain way because the government tells you to.
Well, hello, you beautiful people. Hope you're having a wonderful end to 2025. I'm Israel Balderas, and welcome to Beyond the First podcast. So here's a quick question for you. Did 2025 feel like the First Amendment became less free speech and more free speech terms and conditions apply? Because this year, the story wasn't just what people said. It was who had the leverage: regulators, lawsuits, mergers, approvals, platform algorithms, access. The stuff that sounds boring until it's the reason someone suddenly stops talking. A newsroom starts hedging, or a company decides, you know what, let's just write the check and move on. And that's why this podcast exists. Beyond the First is where we take the speech and power stories everyone argues about online, and we actually break down what's happening underneath, the incentives, the pressure points, and the little administrative moves that don't look like censorship until they work. Today, I'm going to be joined by Chris Terry. He is a good friend of mine, but he's also an amazing legal scholar out of the University of Minnesota. And we're doing a 2025 rewind. What the year revealed about government power, Silicon Valley power, media power, and what all of this means heading into 2026. Let's do this. How are you? Happy end of 2025, man.
It's been a year. It's been a year.
I like how you say that. It's been a year. Listen, before we get into the whole, case this and case that, just what are your thoughts, man? Like, how crazy was 2025 when it comes to the First Amendment?
It certainly is going to change things. And I don't think a lot of people have fully grasped how much. The court's actions across two significant cases have fundamentally changed how the court is going to look at internet content regulation moving forward. And frankly, I don't know that we've fully seen the implications of this. We're only really 6 or 7 months into it, but we've already seen very significant changes occurring as a result of the decisions. Two decisions of note: ByteDance v. Garland, which was the TikTok case decided in January, was followed by the far more important but less noticed case, Free Speech Coalition versus Paxton, which was decided in June.
Yeah, one everybody knows as the TikTok case. The other one everybody kind of knows it's the porn axis, right? It's the, can the government make sure that if you're going to go see Pornhub or you're going to go watch X, that you're over 18. And, when I talk to most people about this case, they always go, well, yeah, of course, they want to protect children. That's always like the compelling interest, right? We want to protect children. But you've been on this kick for a couple of years now, and you said, this is coming, this is coming, this is coming, and it came. And that is relooking, what's the best word? Redoing how the First Amendment plays out on the internet, right? You're like, the government's going to have more power over it. And we kept saying, no, it's not going to happen. And you were right.
And almost uniquely on that point, I was right too. So you have to dial the clock back to 1997 to understand how the internet evolved the way it did. Court looked at the internet in 1997 and tried to decide if it was TV, if it was cable, or if it was a newspaper. And for those of us who've been around long enough to remember what the internet looked like in 1997, court looked at it and said, well, it's a newspaper, because it frankly didn't have streaming video. There was no audio. To download a single still image took minutes, if not hours in some cases. And the court said in 1997 that we think the we think the internet is akin to a newspaper. And for the last basically 30 years, the internet has had almost full protection of the First Amendment. That's fundamentally different than what occurs for broadcast, over the air radio, over the air television, and to a lesser degree for cable programming, the HBOs and the Cinemaxes and the TBSs of the world are in a different category. And I said after the Brandy Levy case that we were at the tipping point, that the court was going to find a case to dial that back and push the internet back into one of the other two categories. And that's what's happened.
And quickly, I know who Brandy Levy is, but talk quickly. This is the cheerleading case. This involved a freshman. And I love this case, by the way, because I tell my students, I can sympathize with the freshman wannabe cheerleader because I was a cheerleader, Chris, in high school. I wore the cheerleading outfit. I know how important it is to make the varsity cheerleading squad. But you know how they always say, don't make a federal case out of this? Well, guess what? The freshman wannabe cheerleader made a case out of this because she said, F everybody, right? F the school, F the team. And of course, the school did what governments always do. Instead of talking to a teenager about, hey, you might want to, be wise about what you post on social media. No, they suspended her. But what happened in that case? Because you and I see that case differently. I think that case is great. Look at how much they protected the freshman cheerleader, right? The court said, sometimes you have to protect the superfluous in order to protect the necessary. And you turn to me and go, yeah, that's bullshit.
It is bullshit, frankly. And for Brandy Levy herself, the decision is correct. She won. She should not have been punished by the school. But for the First Amendment, the Levy case is the ultimate Pyrrhic victory, in that what the court did there is they extended the long-standing Tinker disruption standard and its schoolhouse gate metaphor to the boundaries of the internet. Students can now be punished by a public high school for any content posted in social media at any time that the school believes reflects poorly on the school. Now, students have long been able to be punished for that kind of content inside of the schoolhouse gate. But now the schoolhouse gate incorporates the entirety of social media and the internet. And when that decision came down, I was almost alone. I was on an island by myself being criticized by people I respect for my point of view. And I said, this is the case. This is the one where it's all going to change. And it was only a matter of time now till the Supreme Court would take up a case and resolve the dispute between broadcasting, cable, and the internet. And that's what happened this year. It is absolutely now no longer debatable that I was right about this years ago when Levy's case was first decided.
All right, let's talk about that case. That's Free Speech Coalition versus Paxton. For those who may not be in the know, this involves a Texas law. And the law says if you are a adult website, right? That's what you do. You post porn on the web, that you've got to make sure that there are mechanisms in place so that whoever comes in, you are guaranteed they are at least 18 years old, right? We call this age gating. In other words, the government can say, before you come in, you've got to prove to us that you are of a certain age. Now, this issue, Chris, was handled a long, long time ago. This was not the first time that the court has addressed this issue of age gating. But what was really at the heart of this? What was new about this case? And what had the court decided prior? And then what did the court decide in this situation?
Oh, how long do we have? That's a fairly loaded question there, my friend.
This is a podcast, Chris. We can go on forever if you want to.
So the issue of age verification has its roots all the way back in the Communications Decency Act, which was at the heart of the Reno case that led to the Supreme Court deciding that the internet needed to be treated like a newspaper.
And this is 1996. This is
1996.
This is the Telecommunications Act of 1996. We are still under that framework, right? It was a law that was passed by Congress saying, gosh, there's this new thing called the internet, interwebs, the chat room. So we need to make sure and pass rules and they didn't want to regulate the internet, right? They wanted to call it information superhighway. But along the way, there were things that they wanted to at least make sure didn't happen. And of course, adult content when it was pixelated, whether on cable or on the internet. That's what the congressmen were concerned about.
Well, the story of that is really important. The person who was the biggest advocate for regulating early internet content was a guy named Senator James Exon from Nebraska. His idea was is that early internet, and I'm talking dial-up level internet here, was already infested with pornography at a level that absolutely had to be done with. Now, if you were alive back then, you know that's preposterous. But Exon's point was that we needed to treat the internet like broadcasting and or cable and regulate it for indecency. But the thing is that Exon did this in perhaps the most ham-fisted of ways in an attempting to treat the internet like broadcasting. But we're talking about a guy who was trying to regulate the internet without actually even having, much less an internet connection, a computer in his Senate office at the time. Exon was kind of an interesting character. He was a blue dog Democrat, if people remember what those were. He hated flag burning. He was against gay marriage. He wasn't exactly the most liberal of fellows. But he makes a devil's bargain and gets the CDA, the Communications Decency Act, which is his pet bill, added to Section 6 of the Telecommunications Act. And we are still living under that original framework today. In fact, Congress has not really told the any of the regulatory agencies how to handle the internet since 1996. So if you kind of wonder why things are screwed up with things like broadband and stuff, that's the fundamental reason. But that said, when Exon did this, when they added the CDA to the Telecommunications Act, the Supreme Court did, as I said, they moved it into the newspaper realm. And it was because Exon didn't really understand the internet at all. He walked around with a folder full of it was a blue binder full of pornography to try to convince people to vote for the CDA. But in doing so, and doing it in this ham-fisted way, they actually made the situation worse. Exon is one of the greatest lessons in First Amendment history. The attempt to regulate speech of a certain type that you object to often leads to that speech becoming far more common and more powerful. His effort to regulate the internet for pornography created the literally perfect environment for pornography to exist on the internet in the quantity it does today. Had it not been for the CDA, there probably would have been significant changes implemented. That said, when the CDA went down in the Reno decision in 1997, Congress tried again with a bill called COPA, C-O-P-A, not to be mistaken with the Children's Privacy Online Protection Act. COPA, which has two P's in it. That specifically implemented an age verification system. And if you're old enough to remember, if you looked at some websites back when, a window would pop up asking you what your age was. And the primary mechanism for verifying whether or not you were an adult or not was to to enter a credit card number into an unsecured website, because the belief was that no children would have credit cards back then. That law, COPA, was challenged multiple times, and it went up and down in the court system for years. But in 2004, in Ashcroft 2, Justice Thomas wrote an opinion applying strict scrutiny to the internet, which said that age verification was not the least restrictive means for protecting kids from adult content, pornography, or the like.
And we should probably at least explain to the listening audience or the viewing audience, right? The government can regulate speech, but if it's regulating content, the Supreme Court says, look, you've got to meet two standards. One, you got to tell us why you have to do this. It has to be compelling, right? Of the highest interest. And protecting children is always going to get compelling interest.
Sure.
Thumbs up from the Supreme Court. When we talk about the least
unless
restrictive
it's violence
means,
content. Unless it's violent content.
That's right. That's correct. There's Brown. That's correct. There's video games.
Right.
That's right. But that was Scalia, wasn't it? I thought there was
Yes.
that. I think that's Scalia. So you could understand a lot. As you and I like to say, boy, don't we wish Scalia was alive today. But the least restrictive means is if you want to protect children, you got to do it in the way that takes the least amount of speech, and it's got to be very narrow. And in this case, it wasn't narrow. It was like they were taking as much speech as it was necessary, including taking the speech of adults, right? At least that's what the court pinned their decision. And I should say, Thomas made a point that sometimes you can't ban speech for children when it is perfectly fine for adults to look at this.
And that has always been the standard when it's well, not always, but since the Miller decision in the 70s, that has always been the standard, is if it infringed upon speech for adults, the rule, then it was too broad of a rule. It could not stand, even if the intent was to protect kids. So we decided age verification a long time ago, and Thomas's decision in Ashcroft 2 was actually relatively forward thinking for the time. He suggested that there was a variety of filtering and other mechanisms that the government should explore as less restrictive means than a straight up age verification. And the reason for that is actually pretty simple. The government has to protect your speech, right? You're protected from the government's infringement on speech. But there's a corresponding right that we don't talk about a lot, and that's the compelled speech right. Not only can the government not interfere with your speech, the government is very limited in its powers in what it can make you do to access speech. And of course, if you are looking at adult content, which is protected speech for adults, and you're forced to do something that is technically, at least until very recently, unconstitutional, because you should not have to act in a certain way because the government tells you to access protected speech. To your original question, though, what has changed is that Thomas has changed his point of view. He has adopted Texas's position that absolutely the need to protect kids from pornography on the internet means that age verification, which he derided in very expressive language in 2004, he believes now in 2025 that it is absolutely a mandate that adults be compelled to access this content, and that's not a significant infringement on adults' free speech rights. Now, you don't have to take my word for it that it is an infringement. Justice Thomas said so himself over 20 years ago. And if you look at the history of compelled speech cases, it's pretty clear that age verification is compelled speech. The problem now, though, and what the decision unleashes upon us is not that even if you talk to people in the pornography industry, they don't want kids looking at their content. That's problematic on all kinds of levels, right? The problem is now is that the Supreme Court approved a state law. And that means that individual state age verification laws are all going to have to be tested. But individual age verification laws at the state level are also all different from each other. So if you're in the business of delivering content to people, right, regardless of what you think of pornography, they have to comply currently, as we record this today, with 38 different state laws. And most of them, if you lay them all out, conflict with each other in at least one or two ways. So you are now responsible for being able to speak based on where the receiver of the information is put. And that's a substantial burden, regardless of what you think of pornography, good or bad. The problem is that to do this, and this is the point that matters, the Supreme Court could no longer treat the internet like a newspaper. And they have dialed back the protection for internet content in very radical ways, down to the level that basically applies to cable television or commercial speech. And if you know anything about cable, and you used to watch movies on cable, you know that even indecent content, profane content, is often censored out when movies are run on basic cable. That's where we are headed for the internet in terms of content regulation. So you might think this is about porn. You described this case as the porn case. It's not a porn case. It really is an internet free speech case. And what we have Thomas has created by basically reversing himself, something he's gotten very common in doing, especially when it comes to media and First Amendment cases. What we have now is a reality that speech on the internet is no longer protected fully by the First Amendment, and the government can regulate it in an unimaginable number of ways now that it just couldn't do even 6 months ago. And we've already seen the effects of that. Congress just 2 weeks ago took up 13 different bills, all of which are content regulation bills for internet or social media. And every single one of those bills would have been dead letter law the minute it hit the floor just 6 months ago.
Let me play devil's advocate for just a moment, because I know, again, you and I are parents. We are talking about the law that has developed over 30 years. The technology is not even close to what it was 30 years ago. And we haven't even touched on the issue of AI. But let me at least throw this in. Pornography has done real damage to the lives of young children, to the Gen Zers, to the Gen A'ers that are coming up. Even the American Bar Association has a website that says, "Look, here's the real harm." So when I talk to people about this case, and you say it's not about porn, it's about free speech on the internet. Fair enough, but do we not have sometimes the obligation to go, look? It may not be 100%. It may be 90%, 80%. We will still get speech. We just won't get it completely in an absolutist kind of way, the way Justice Hugo Black would have wanted. And that's okay, because the internet now is like broadcasting. It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. You can access it on your phone. You can access it on your watch. So therefore, we just need some rules of the road that at least has a utilitarian principle in it. We got to protect the most vulnerable. And if it means that we're going to have, 38 different ways for, Pornhub to have to send its videos to, customers, mostly in red states, mostly in religious states, then that's okay, right? Cable is regulated at the local level. You've got different types of rules when it comes to cable regulation, city by city, county by county. Why not take that approach now to say, look, if we have to ban some speech in order to protect the most vulnerable, we can live with that.
Well, I respect the idea, but my First Amendment principles are a little more extreme than most people. I am certainly not a consumer of pornography. I am a happily married Catholic man. But for me, it's more of a principle thing. It starts with porn, right? It starts with porn, and then it moves quickly. And you don't have to take my word for it. Congress is taking up bills that don't have anything to do with porn to regulate all kinds of content. And they can do that now because we didn't hold the line on defending porn. Now, remember, you don't have to like porn. You don't. There's no rule that says you have to like it. There's all kinds of speech out there that I would stand up for that I absolutely loathe. But that's exactly the point, is that if you want to protect the most vulnerable, you have to protect the worst among us. And you've known me a long time. You know that this is one of my defining principles, that most free speech law, the reason that we have the kind of freedoms that we have, is because people have stood up for the worst among us, the Anthony Aloneses, the Clarence Brandenburgs, right? They're horrible people, right? And by
Westboro
standing up for
Baptist.
them, right, Westboro Baptist, a great example, right? But by standing up for those people, we defend important speech. By making this a argument over whether or not kids should have access to pornography, you have played in the frame that allows for content regulation to occur. And that is problematic. But in terms of complying with the 38 laws, I mean, Pornhub's got plenty of money and they've got plenty of technicians and lawyers and all those things. But the thing is that the way these laws are, because they don't have to meet a higher level of scrutiny, they're almost impossible to comply with. So if you talk to people in the porn industry, and I do because I am an avid First Amendment defender, the thing that I'm hearing from them is that they want to comply with these laws. Like they are ecstatic about the idea that kids won't be able to look at porn and that they'll be able to do their business with adults who they want to do it with. The problem is that the laws are so shakily written, and because they don't have to meet an exacting scrutiny standard, they can't be complied with. And that is a real problem, because now you have allowed speech to be infringed without any of the actual benefits that you sought to do. And that, I'm sorry, I can understand why people object to porn and its accessibility on the internet. But in some ways, the fact that it is freely available means that there's lots of other really important speech that is also freely available. And my belief is that will no longer be the case. The internet will look far more like broadcasting and far more like cable, really, moving forward. And there's going to be a generation of people who remember what the internet was like for a period of time. It won't look like that in 20 years if this is allowed to stand.
So let's look forward, because we've been talking about Free Speech Coalition. There's also the TikTok case. I don't want to spend too much time in it, but basically that's the Supreme Court saying, yeah, if the government believes that it has a reason to force the sale of an app for national security purposes, it can do so. And now, almost 2.5 years later, it turns out that TikTok is going to be bought by people who are going to have incredible amount of control over what young people see, right? China's going to own a little bit of it. The Larry Ellisons of the world are going to own a little bit of it. But going forward now, Chris, we've got this world of AI. And there are things that are great about it. There are things that are terrible at it, right? The worst of the worst, we've seen the headlines. Kids committing suicide because a chatbot told them to. And you've got a state like California who now is wanting to regulate whether or not kids can access AI tools. But now comes Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley says, we don't want any kind of regulation. Let us do whatever we want. And they have gotten President Trump, to sign an executive order saying, we are going to mandate deregulation. We're going to say there's going to be federal preemption in this area. States cannot regulate AI, and we're not going to regulate AI from Washington, D.C. How do you see these two cases, TikTok and Free Speech Coalition, impacting now the road ahead when it comes to a world that is being consumed with AI?
Well, this is I don't know how deep into preemption you want to go, but realistically, the federal government cannot prevent the states from implementing their own controls. That's basically what Free Speech Coalition was about at some level or another. The ability of a state to regulate AI content if it's online was increased by the concepts in Free Speech Coalition. But we haven't had any cases that have pursued that to conclusion yet to test that theory.
Yeah, this is very new.
The first one will be the Minnesota case. Minnesota has had a deepfake law on the books for several years. X and Elon Musk specifically are challenging that law in a case against the Attorney General of Minnesota, Keith Ellison. That case is headed very quickly to court and probably to an appeal here very soon over Minnesota's deepfake law, which was designed to, ironically, it was a two-part law. The first part was to prevent people from using deepfake to influence elections. And then the second part, which is the part that Musk is challenging, frankly. And then the second part was actually criminal punishments for AI use to commit revenge porn. That law, on its face, under strict scrutiny, patently unconstitutional.